Hello again, everyone. So I wanted to tackle another question that sort of come in the comments to videos and on social media. And this relates to when we give offerings to or leave food for the good folk. Why is it usually dairy? And it's a good question, and it's a good topic to kind of dig into. The answer is a little complicated, as many things are with this subject. We don't have anything in folklore that very clearly says this is why we will give them dairy products. We do know across the array of folklore that dairy products, specifically milk and cream, as well as to a lesser degree butter, are very common things in tradition to be given or to be left for the good neighbors. So I do want to specify also at the beginning here that I am going to be mostly answering this through the lens of Celtic language speaking culture and folklore. I am aware that sort of worldwide fairy-like beings, milk and cream are actually really common. It's sort of a fascinating phenomena that we find this concept of giving them milk sort of across multiple cultures, but that's out of my purview. My main focus is the Celtic language speaking cultures, specifically Ireland, to a lesser degree Scotland, and then kind of secondarily Norse, but I really don't want to try to guess why cultures outside of those would give milk or dairy products. I'm really going to specifically focus here on the Celtic language speaking ones. So when we look at the question, why dairy? The first answer we can kind of find comes to us specifically from Irish mythology. There's a story called The Taking of the She, which explains sort of how the Tuatha Dé Danann ended up going into the fairy hills, and then goes on to explain how one of the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Angus Mac and Og, attained Shean Broga, which is a specific she that had belonged to someone else first. That's the bulk of the story. But the point here is that at the beginning of that story, it explains that when the Tuatha Dé Danann first went into the She, into the fairy hills, the Gaels, the Milesians, the humans who had taken Ireland, found that their crops wouldn't grow and their cows wouldn't produce milk. And they had to make a friendship or a compact with a god named the Dagda. And part of that agreement was that the humans afterwards would give a portion of their harvest and a portion of their milk to the Tuatha Dé Danann, to the gods. And this passed down into folklore, and we find it in folkloric accounts. For example, Marion McNeil's Festival of Nyasa mentions this. The idea that the fairies then, the good folk of the fairy hills, are owed a tithe or a portion of the harvest. And this does seem to directly come from the older myth connected to the Tuatha Dé Danann, who went into the fairy hills and became counted among the number of the Aishi, or the people of the fairy hills, which I should probably do an entire separate video trying to disambiguate that. But the point here is that when we look at mythology, we find this explanation that says that a portion of the crops, and specifically as well a portion of the milk, is owed to them. It is their due. So that certainly plays into why dairy products and milk are common offerings or commonly given to them. The second answer to the question is a little more philosophical and a little more supposition on my part, but I do want to include it here. And for that, we have to look at more broadly when we are offering things, when we are giving things to the fair folk, or when they are taking them, food specifically. We know that they don't actually, the majority of the time, don't physically take the food. If you leave out a little cake and a little bowl of milk, the majority of the time, the next day, the actual food items will still be there. The belief is that they take the essence of the food, the soul of it, the spirit of it, the value from it. And this is called different things across different sources. So Reverend Robert Kirk, writing in the 17th century, refers to this as the foison. Foison is a Scots dialect word, basically just means the essence, the substance. Campbell, in his Gaelic Otherworld, refers to it as the Torah. I may be mispronouncing that because my Gaelic is not 100% perfect, but Toradh is how it's spelled. And again, this would be like the substance, the produce, the essence of it. In fairy faith and Celtic countries, Evans Wentz refers to this as the quintessence, sort of the soul, if you will, of the food item. So the belief is then that when you offer something to the good folk, food-wise, they leave behind the physical substance, but they take the value from it, the essential part of it that's nutritional, that's actually needed. And there's various related folk beliefs. Some say that if you then eat the food that has had this quintessence, this foison taken from it, it's not healthy for you, it's not good for you, it'll make you sick, or you'll simply waste away because the food then has no value. Other sources, though, say that it's kind of accepted that animals may eat the remains of the food that are left. Or even in some areas of Ireland, there's talk of offerings that are left out that then the poorer members of the community might come along and take. So there's a divided opinion on whether food that's been offered to the fairies and that they've taken the substance from, whether it is then safe or not for other people or other animals to consume. There's no definitive answer there. However, I'm mentioning all of this because the idea that they take the substance or the essence from something implies that they would generally prefer foods that have a lot or an abundance of this quintessence. Things that are fresh, things that are full of life, basically. It makes sense then that dairy products, specifically milk and cream, and in the folklore we find references to milk literally fresh from the cow. In some cases the milk would be poured on the ground right after milking as an offering to them. So this idea that it's as close to the source as possible, they'll take fruit and crops right from the fields, things like that, sort of gives us this idea that they prefer things that are as full of that life force, as full of that substance, quintessence, foison, as possible. We can also sort of assume from that they would not prefer or not like food items or offerings that lack that essential substance. You would have to sort of decide for yourself what you feel would be lacking quintessence. I would personally suggest that probably things that are full of a lot of chemicals and additives and further and further from their natural state as food items would be less acceptable and less appealing and have less of that foison in it. When we're looking, however, directly at the question of why dairy, I think the answer comes down to particularly fresh raw milk and cream have a very high amount of this quintessence, of this life force, of this substance in it that we know across Celtic folklore, Celtic language speaking folklore, that these beings prefer, that they're sort of seeking out. And I think we can also sort of bridge here into the argument that the more predatory of the good neighbors, the ones that are known to feed on human beings, whether we're talking the Lonanshi, the Bovanshi, Kelpies, hags, are probably also effectively feeding on this quintessence, on this foison. They're just taking it directly from living animals, in those cases humans. So I mention that because it sort of all connects into this idea that this is this substance that these beings are seeking out and consuming and sort of surviving on, if you will. So why dairy? Because dairy has a high percentage of that. If you don't want to offer dairy, if you are vegan or you have ethical issues with modern industrial farming, that's fine. I would just suggest keeping in mind that you would then want to give them something that would have that equivalent sort of substance to it. So maybe fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, something that you're ethically okay with, but that would still have that substance. I personally would suggest, as I'd mentioned earlier, avoiding anything that's very artificial in nature, just because that would seem to be lacking that soul, that essential substance that they're actually looking for or feeding on. So, nice quick video today. Hopefully this answers the question of why dairy. I will also very quickly add here at the end, I generally advise not offering meat. As I sort of infamously said once at PantheaCon out in California in a conference that I was giving a class at, humans are made of meat. Not generally something we prefer to think about, but it is true. And if you're making a habit of offering meat or meat-related substances, you are going to draw the sorts of things that are interested in that particular food source. It's probably not the direction you might want to go in. Definitely not the safest direction to go in. So, would not offer meat personally. Maybe a few exceptions on like special occasions if you're sharing an entire meal. Cooked meat, okay. Otherwise, not so much. But dairy, lots of quintessence to it. That seems to be why they want it. And also tying into the mythology that is something that humans sort of a long time ago made an agreement to give them or to offer to them. So it has both of those aspects connected to it. Anyway, if you have any thoughts about this, feel free to drop it in the comments. Any additional questions, feel free to drop it in the comments. But that sort of sums up everything on this particular subject, and I hope that answered the question, why dairy? There we go. I'll see everyone later.